In July of 2025, the Transportation Energy Institute released a new report entitled Consumer Survey 2025 Driver Behaviors and Perspectives. This is a continuation of a series of reports that TEI has done over the years where we actually go out there and interview consumers to kind of get an idea what their perspective is, consistent with our mindset that ultimately the consumer is the decision maker. And if we can understand their perspective, their preferences, and what is driving their behavior, it'll be easier to bring innovative solutions on emissions reduction and cost savings to them and be successfully introduced to the market. So what I want to do today is walk through some of the key observations that came from that study. First of all, we did a survey in middle of May 2025 in coordination with NACS and Bold Decision, who ran the survey for us. You see here 1,200 American adults, 95% confidence level, and a plus or minus margin of error of less than 3%. So pretty accurate representation. In our report and in this presentation, we'll be talking about specific demographic groups that I've shown here. That kind of tells you an idea of what the breakdown is. My focus when we're looking at this will be on demographic groups that have a response that's either higher or lower than the national average. So we break it down the gender, age group, region of the country, type of community, rural, suburban, urban. We do have a breakout for commute frequency. That's more relevant to certain questions and not so relevant to some others, and we'll flag that when appropriate. We take a look at their education level and their income level, which are quite often very determinant issues in terms of how consumers are going to behave and how they're going to address different factors. So to start off, the key takeaways, highlighted just three here. Consumers still are very concerned about fuel prices. And it's interesting because fuel prices at this time of the survey in 2025 were 40 cents lower on a national average than they were the year before when we did the survey. But still, almost 3/4 of consumers said that price is the number one factor when deciding where to buy gas. And price echoes through a lot of the results we see in the survey. Is in May, it was a time when tariffs were being dropped on imported vehicles. There had not been any negotiated relaxation to that. So clearly there was a lot of news about the pending increase in prices, and half of consumers said that now at that time was a bad time to buy a vehicle and that prices would be higher in 2026. And less than 40% said that they were somewhat or very likely to buy or lease a vehicle in the next 2 years. On the flip side, electric vehicles, 44% had a positive attitude in May, and 31% were more positive than the year before. And that's reflective in sales numbers that we've been watching throughout the year. So through August, even before the rush to buy EVs, before the federal tax incentive went away, through August, Americans had purchased more electric vehicles in 2025 than they did during the entire 12-month period of 2024. So some real positive signs about the future of electric vehicles, even in a time when there seems to be a lot of retreat from policies and commitments from some OEMs. It really, I think, is reflecting that the market has an opportunity to right size and deliver to consumers what the consumers want. And the growing attitude is more and more consumers are interested. When we look, it'll turn now to the big story, which I think, and this has been the case since I've been in the industry for more than 20 years, price is king. And we ask consumers, how much do gas prices affect your feelings about the economy? We've asked this question for about 20 years. 48% said some impact, 31% said a great impact. It means 80 or 79% of consumers said that, the price of gas has a significant impact on how they feel about the economy. And, that tall price sign is a bellwether. It really does indicate to you where the market's going, and it tells consumers, the economy is doing well, the economy is doing poorly, it's affecting my wallet or it's not. So that's something to continue to pay attention to. And it reflects in the 72% said that price determines mostly where they buy gas. We know that's not always the case. And when we look at the next slide here, we asked them, what would you do to save 5 cents a gallon? You've got 24% strongly agreed they'd turn left across a busy street for 5 cents, and 20% said they strongly agree, yeah, I drive 10 minutes out of my way to save 10 cents a gallon, 5 cents a gallon. The reality is not that. They're much more time sensitive than they indicate in the survey. They will go for what's convenient, what has amenities, what has a loyalty program they like. But in their mind, that price is the driving factor. And so that can't be dismissed. While reality may not mimic what they say they would do, the fact that this is what they're saying tells us that price is very important to them and they want it to be important to people they're talking to. We also took a look at what's going on in the market for E15, which is a gasoline blended with up to 15% ethanol. And I put it in the price component section of this presentation because that's an important element. So first, we asked people, have you been given the opportunity to buy E15 in the past month? And those who said, yes, I have. We then asked them, did you buy it? And 42% of those who had the opportunity did purchase E15. And when we asked them why, and you take a look there, 46% said it was a lower price. Close to 45% said it was they cared about the environment. And then because E15 sold usually as an 88 octane fuel, with big chunks of it about a higher octane. So you're seeing that value is driving some of the interest in E15, which is consistent with that factor of price. And if you can offer E15 at a lower price, and the consumer has a vehicle that can run on it, then they may be inclined to do so. And that's something that we need to think about is how do you take advantage of the price sensitivity of the consumer to offer them a new product? Before we start talking about what the future of the vehicle market might look like, we need to understand what the vehicle market looks like today. So we ask consumers, what kind of vehicle do you have in your household? First of all, we found out that most households only have one vehicle. 48% have one vehicle, 28% have two vehicles. What's interesting is 11% of households do not have any vehicle. Now, I assume if we were to cross-reference that, they're likely going to be the college age, or they're going to be in urban settings where having a car may not be required to get around. But I thought that was an interesting nugget in that data. When we asked them, you have vehicles, what kind of vehicle do you have at home? 85% of households have a gas-powered vehicle. So you start thinking about that's the base we're starting with. 8% have hybrids and 6% have battery electric vehicles and 4% have diesel. But we start thinking, okay, how quickly will this market change? Start thinking about this breakout here. Where are we starting from? And then we start looking at what they're willing to buy, and we look at what they actually do buy. That gives you an idea of how quickly the market may turn over to something new, how successful a new technology might be when introduced to the market. Of those who own hybrids, this is the demographic comparative slide I mentioned. That orange line is the average that we saw in the last slide. Look at the red bars that are above the average. So 18 to 34-year-olds, those living in the West, those with college degrees, those earning $100,000 or more for household. The commute on the end is interesting. I would have expected your daily commuters to be more inclined to have a hybrid. The not daily ones actually outperform on owning hybrids. And so I'm not sure that there's really a correlation there, but it's an interesting nugget. The other thing to look at is the red bars are low. Those 50 to 64, those living in the Midwest, those living in rural America, those earning less than $50,000 a year, they're all sitting there quite a bit below, in general, below 5% of households. So you do see some variability by demographics. Same analysis with battery electric vehicles. The age bracket's a little different. 35 to 49 is more likely, could be an income basis. Those in the West still, those are college educations, those 100,000 miles, those not commuting daily. Again, I don't know if that one's correlated relevant here. But even more interesting is those who do not have an EV in their household, those 65 and older. Living in the Midwest, rural communities, those with only high school or less education, those earning less than $50,000 a year. Again, there's a lot of income affordability factors involved in who can own an EV, because they are typically more expensive than your comparable gasoline-powered vehicle. Now, we know 85% of households own a gasoline-powered vehicle. but that's the vehicle they drive the most. 89% of people most commonly drive their gasoline vehicle. 5% drive a hybrid and 4% drive their BEV. I think interestingly, 1% drive diesel. Maybe that diesel that's owned in the household is a pickup truck that's only used for running errands or pulling trailers or boats or something like that. So interesting use case scenario. If we could dive deeper into interviews, we might explore that. But interesting that the gasoline is still their go-to on the most of the time. And again, that's fundamentally important when we start thinking about how quickly might the market change to accommodate other technologies. So we know where they are, where do they want to go, and how quickly might they get there? As I mentioned in the opening slide, majority of people don't think now is a good time to buy a vehicle. Half say it's a bad time, and 2/3 say the price is going to go up next year. So that is a pretty pessimistic attitude on that. But we also mentioned, 39% believe that they would buy a vehicle, could buy a vehicle in the next 2 years. And we look at the demographics, it's fairly consistent. There's not a lot of variability. 65 and older crowds a little more pessimistic. The 35 and 49 crowds a little more pessimistic than the general average, but overall, there's not a ton of variability by demographic profile. Now we start thinking about what kind of vehicle might they be interested in buying. 82% would be likely to consider buying a gasoline vehicle. Consistent, that's what they're used to. That's the dominant vehicle offered on the market. And that's what they have in their garage already. That being said, 37% would consider a hybrid, and 28% would consider a battery electric or a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. 26% would consider a vehicle that could run on any gasoline blend up to 85% ethanol. Not very many of those available in the market. There's like 4 or 5 models now being produced that can run on that. But should that change, there's still a market for flex fuel vehicles to find a customer. So that's an interesting dynamic in terms of where the market may head. Which are looking at who would be interested in considering a hybrid. Again, the orange bar is your average. You have several demographic profiles that are higher than the average. Nothing significantly higher other than the college graduate and the $100,000 or above and the not daily commuter. A little more significance in those that are below the average, the 50 to 65 range. Females are lower than males in terms of likely to consider a hybrid. And then rural consumers and those earning less than $50,000, which I think is still consistent with the economics issue before. But interesting that the gender disparity, and it'd be interesting to dive in a little bit deeper. We did not do that on the survey, but it'd be interesting to find out what's going on there. I started thinking about the battery electric vehicle. Again, a few demographic groups are higher than the average, men more than women. Those in the West and urban environments. Those are college degrees, those making $100,000 or more. And then again, those less likely, 65 and older, living in rural America, living in the Midwest, or earning less than 50,000. So a lot of consistencies in terms of demographic groups that may be interested in trying something different than a gasoline-powered vehicle. Now, when they go shopping, what's most important? Here's where price starts to rear its head again. The number one attribute when you have to rank order these is price by a variable about 20% over reliability and safety. Fuel economy is interesting. I would assume that might be a little higher, but price is the dominant factor. That makes sense. They're most concerned about gasoline prices. They're most concerned about purchase price, and that could give an indication as to why there may be some lag in interest in the alternative vehicles that might carry a higher purchase price point. Look at who is most interested in price. The orange bar again is the average. Female buyers are a little bit more interested than their male counterparts. The older consumers are more interested and more focused on price, which I find interesting. They're typically the more affluent, but that is what it is. Babies, because they're the ones that are actually in the market to buy a car, and those younger ages aren't in the market to buy a vehicle. The price isn't that important. But again, this is among those who are somewhat or very likely to buy a vehicle in the next 2 years. And then obviously the lower income demographics are much more interested in the price of the vehicle. So we dove a little deeper into electric vehicles, understand what's going on there, and we found some interesting stuff. So as I mentioned before, 44% of consumers are positive about EVs, and 31 have become more positive. So you look at the current attitude, you've got 18% are very positive, but on the flip side, 15% are very negative. Okay. Somewhat positive, 26%, much stronger than the somewhat negative. So in that middle range, there's a little more that people tend on the more positive side, whereas on the extreme range, it's much more balanced. In terms of have your attitude changed, half Americans, their attitude hasn't changed. But you look at somewhat more positive is double the somewhat more negative, and the much more positive is much higher than the much more negative. So the reputation of electric vehicles is improving, and that's shown in the sales figures I mentioned earlier. We take a look at who has a positive attitude on electric vehicles. Again, nothing real surprising here. Younger consumers, those in the West and urban environments, college degrees, higher income. The converse is true for the older consumers, those in the Midwest, rural America, lower income. Now you look at some of the things that influence people's behavior is familiarity. So we asked them, how often do you see electric vehicles in the area where you live or work? And you have 17% said very often, 21% said somewhat often. So 38% responded often, or 7% extremely often. So that's 38, 45% said they see electric vehicles often. Much higher than the 27% said rarely or never, which means that consumer behavior, consumers like things they're familiar with. And we asked, do you have a place to charge at home? 10% said they don't know. 53% said, yeah, I think I have a suitable place to charge at home. You see the breakouts here. Those with 100,000 or more are probably the outlier. Those college degrees, somewhat of an outlier. They're probably the ones that have single family homes, have garage or a 2-car garage, and have the means to install an at-home charger and the space to do it. But still pretty good number. Half the people have a place to charge at home. So that gives them a comfort level. And again, that increases their likelihood to consider an EV if they believe they can charge at home, save money by not having to charge in public and pay public charging rates, and also not have to rely on the installation of chargers that is still in kind of a pretty nascent stage of development. 59% said that they think finding public charging would be hard. So again, the contrast here. More than half believe they can charge at home, and 60% almost say, yeah, and if I can't charge at home, charging outside the home is going to be hard. That's a hurdle to EV adoption. That's something that needs to be resolved by the installation of more chargers, more visibility of the chargers that are in place, ensuring reliability so that there's no fear of pulling up to a charger and you can't charge. Redundancy in a market. If one site has a charger, across the street having a charger helps. We actually learned from one of the organizations we work with that does analysis of charging behavior that concentrated public charging facilities actually have higher utilization than those that are more solitary. People seem to gravitate where there are multiple chargers available. So interesting indication that more work needs to be done on public charging. 73% of consumers think that, put chargers at convenience stores. And I think it makes sense. They've been going to convenience stores, gas stations for 100 years to refuel their vehicle. It's a natural inclination for them. Now they're going to spend 20, 30 minutes there. Convenience stores have bathrooms. They have prepared foods. They have grocery items. They're usually in an area where there's other things they can walk to. So, people want to be able to shop when they're charging. They recognize they're going to be spending 20, 30 minutes on average charging their vehicle. They want something to do other than just sit in their car. So you see where the preference is now. Ironically, there's more chargers at fast food and restaurants than there are at convenience stores and gas stations. So trying to flip that ratio and deliver to the customer what the customer wants is really important. So that's kind of a high level summary of it. If you want to download the report, it's free. It's at transportationenergy.org. We have a few other assets that help kind of dive a little deeper and give different perspectives on the results here. But I hope you found the presentation helpful. I hope you find the report helpful. And if there's any questions, please feel free to reach out to us anytime. Thanks for paying attention and listening. We'll talk to you soon.